Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Rain's Vengeance. The storm came suddenly, as if the sky had ripped open and spilled its fury upon the earth. Dark clouds swallowed the sun in an instant, and a howling wind carried the unmistakable scent of rain. The dense forest seemed to breathe with the wind, the trees swaying violently as though they, too, could sense the oncoming deluge. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip, just a weekend getaway to break the monotony of city life. Matt, Sarah, Ben, and Jessica had been looking forward to escaping the demands of work and school for a few days. They were experienced campers, and they knew the forest well, but they didn't know this part of it. As they trudged through the mud, the first drops of rain hit the ground, soft and sporadic. Sarah was the first to notice the shape emerging from the thick woods ahead, a small, weather-beaten cabin. Its silhouette was barely visible through the rain, the wood gray and warped, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The cabin stood alone, abandoned and forgotten. "We should take shelter there," Jessica suggested, her voice rising over the sound of the wind. "Good idea," Matt said, pulling his hood tighter over his head. "I don't want to be caught in a downpour without cover." The group quickly made their way to the cabin, the rain now falling in sheets, drenching them to the bone. As they reached the rickety wooden steps, the door creaked open, almost as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the smell of mildew and rot filled the air, and the flickering light of their lanterns illuminated cracked walls and dusty furniture. A fireplace stood cold and unused, with an old rug lying in the center of the room. "It's creepy, but at least it'll keep us dry," Ben remarked, looking around with a nervous laugh. They spread out, each of them unpacking their things and getting settled. The storm outside only grew stronger, the wind howling like some great beast, shaking the windows of the cabin and rattling the door. The temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She glanced out the window, watching the sheets of rain slashing against the glass. "I've got a bad feeling about this place," she murmured. Matt, who had been scanning the room, paused when his eyes landed on something strange, a faded portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. It depicted a family, a mother, father, and 2 young children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing. But the eyes of the figures in the painting seemed wrong, hollow, as if they were looking right at him. "Hey guys, look at this," he called to the others. The group gathered around him, their lanterns casting strange shadows on the portrait. Sarah's gaze lingered on the mother's face, her features eerily contorted as if the woman had been frozen in a moment of great pain. Ben shuddered. "Maybe it's just old," Jessica said, trying to brush off the unease creeping over her. But Matt couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where the fireplace stood cold and empty. As the wind howled louder outside, the cabin seemed to grow colder still. The temperature dropped, and their breaths began to form little clouds in the air. The fire in the hearth wouldn't catch, no matter how hard they tried. Then, suddenly, the storm outside shifted. The rain intensified, and with it, something else, the sounds of muffled whispers. At first, it was barely audible, a faint murmur carried by the wind. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew clearer, becoming words, then full sentences. They seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin, echoing in strange patterns that made no sense. It was as if the building itself were alive, filled with voices from the past. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "What's going on?" Ben said, his voice rising. "Where's that coming from?" The whispers began to merge into one single voice, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. "Leave now." The temperature dropped even further, and Sarah's heart began to race. The storm outside grew even more violent, the wind howling and the rain pounding the cabin as though trying to tear it apart. The whispers turned into shouts, then into screams. The figures in the portrait seemed to twist, their mouths opening wide in agony, their eyes burning with rage. "We should go," Matt said, his voice tight. "Now." But as he turned toward the door, something stopped him. The wooden beams of the cabin groaned and shifted. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire structure. Matt tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in his chest. "It's locked," he shouted. The whispers were growing louder now, becoming incoherent cries for help, threats of vengeance. The group could feel the anger, the pain, the suffering like a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on them. As Sarah backed away from the door, she noticed something strange, a small, weathered journal lying on the floor near the fireplace. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, the cover torn and faded. She picked it up, flipping through the brittle pages. As she read the words, her voice faltered. It's a journal. It belonged to someone named Emma. She was the mother in the portrait. The others gathered around as Sarah read aloud, her voice trembling. The journal detailed the family's life in the cabin, how they had once lived in peace, but then a tragedy. Emma's husband had been accused of a terrible crime, a crime he did not commit, but which the villagers believed in their hearts. The whispers began after the crime, and the family's torment was unrelenting. Emma had tried to escape, but the rain had always returned, washing the memories of their suffering into the soil, their souls trapped within the very land. They were executed, Sarah read, her voice growing soft with horror. The rain brought back their souls, trapped in the cabin, cursed to seek revenge on anyone who enters. A cold chill swept over them. The storm outside began to shift again, the winds howling louder, almost as if answering the voices of the past. Ben's eyes darted toward the windows, but the rain had turned to a thick, black sludge streaming down the glass. "They want us to leave," Jessica whispered, her face pale with terror. "But they're not going to let us." Just then, The floorboards creaked, and a shadow passed across the room, moving too quickly for anyone to see. The whispers grew more frantic, more desperate. "They're coming," Matt said, his voice barely a whisper. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as though the walls themselves were alive. The portraits of the family, once just eerie, were now filled with faces contorted in rage and sorrow. The voices from the walls grew louder, louder still. The door shook violently, and the lock seemed to give way. But as it opened, the storm outside had stopped. The rain had ceased. The air was thick with tension. With no time left to hesitate, the group bolted from the cabin, but not before Sarah saw something that chilled her to the core. The face of Emma, her hollow eyes staring at her from the doorway, a silent cry of vengeance. And behind Emma, the others, her husband, the children, stood watching them leave, their souls bound to the cabin forever. They ran as fast as they could, not stopping until the cabin was far behind them. But as they glanced back through the trees, they could see the storm still raging. Only it was there in the distance, waiting for the next group of lost souls to enter. The curse of the rain's vengeance would never stop. Story 2. The Shifting Woods. The rain fell relentlessly, drenching the thick canopy of trees and sending sheets of water cascading down the forest floor. Every step Ethan took felt heavier, his boots sinking into the muddy ground with each attempt to move forward. The dark, oppressive woods had swallowed him whole. His map had gotten soaked, the ink now blurred beyond recognition. The compass he had relied on earlier had begun to fail him, the needle spinning wildly in a futile dance. He'd lost track of time hours ago, and with the rain coming down in torrents, his situation was growing more desperate by the minute. He wasn't supposed to be here. This was supposed to be an easy weekend camping trip, just a solo retreat to clear his mind, to escape the noise of the world for a few days. But as he trudged through the dense forest, the rain falling harder by the second, he could no longer ignore the creeping sense of dread that had settled over him. He wasn't alone in these woods. It wasn't just the eerie stillness after the rain, the silence of the forest pressing down on him. No, there was something else, something wrong. As the storm intensified, the trees grew thicker, the foliage more tangled. Ethan glanced up, squinting through the veil of rain, hoping for a glimpse of something that could help him find his way. That's when he saw it, something unusual. A faint light flickered through the trees ahead, a small campfire glimmering faintly against the downpour. It was out of place in the middle of nowhere, but the warmth of it was inviting. Relief surged through him, and he pushed forward, the wet brush scraping against his clothes as he made his way toward the light. It wasn't far. Soon, he emerged into a small clearing, his feet crunching through the wet leaves. The campfire flickered weakly in the center of a clearing, surrounded by a dilapidated tent and a rickety, half-broken camp chair. There were no signs of life, no other hikers, no animals. Just the fire, casting eerie shadows over the abandoned site. The remnants of a half-eaten meal were scattered on the ground, as if someone had left in a hurry. Ethan hesitated. The air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere was dense with secrets. It didn't make sense. Who could be out here in a storm like this? And why would they leave so abruptly? He approached cautiously, setting his pack down by the edge of the firelight. The warmth of the fire was inviting, but it didn't seem to offer any comfort. It felt wrong somehow, as if it was mocking him. The wind howled louder, pushing the rain sideways, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound, the unmistakable crackle of footsteps through the underbrush. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked around quickly, but the campfire's weak glow didn't reach far enough to illuminate the shadows between the trees. The footsteps were muffled, but close, too close. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the empty woods. He waited, but there was no reply. The footsteps continued, drawing closer. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there, just beyond the firelight. Panic began to coil in his chest, his instincts urging him to run. But he couldn't bring himself to move. Something was keeping him rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a primal fear that had no rational explanation. The footsteps paused, as if the thing, whatever it was waiting. Ethan's pulse raced. His mind screamed at him to leave, but his legs refused to obey. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. There was only silence. Even the rain seemed to quiet for a brief moment, as if holding its breath. Ethan's gaze darted back to the campfire. The shadows around him seemed to stretch unnaturally long, the trees bending in ways they shouldn't. For a brief moment, it felt as if the forest itself had shifted, tilting at odd angles. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the dizziness. But when he looked again, everything had changed. The trees, those familiar, towering trees, were no longer in their previous positions. They had moved. The clearing he had stumbled into was no longer open. Now, it was surrounded by a maze of trunks, their branches twisting unnaturally, closing off every possible exit. It was as if the forest had reshaped itself while he had been standing there, its very form changing before his eyes. His heart pounded. He took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The woods were alive. He didn't know how or why, but the trees were no longer static. They were moving, rearranging themselves, trapping him in an ever-shifting labyrinth. With a sudden jolt of terror, Ethan realized the direction he had come from no longer existed. The path that led him to the clearing had vanished, replaced by an entirely different set of trees and underbrush. The forest stretched on endlessly, as if it had opened up into some twisted dimension, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. Okay, stay calm, Ethan muttered to himself, trying to center himself. It's just the rain, the storm. I'm imagining things. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the storm. The trees around him creaked and groaned, their trunks bending unnaturally, as if some unseen force was pushing them from within. The ground shifted under his feet, the earth softening like wet clay. The woods had changed again. Desperation clawed at him. He turned in the direction he thought was east, the way he had come from, but the trees had formed a wall. He couldn't see the campfire anymore, couldn't see the clearing. He was lost. He spun around again, trying to find any sign of where he was, but it was hopeless. Every direction looked the same now. The trees had grown taller, thicker, and they seemed to stretch endlessly, their branches curling together to form an unbroken canopy. The rain began to pick up again, heavier now, pouring down in sheets that blurred his vision. He ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to move. The footsteps had returned, just behind him, slow and deliberate, but louder now, closer. He could hear them breathing, a crack of a branch behind him, a sudden rush of wind. He whipped around, but there was nothing there. The woods were still. The rain pounded down like an army of drums, the sound deafening. Ethan's chest tightened. His breath became shallow. The forest was closing in on him, its twisting trees pressing in from all sides, the walls of foliage constricting, suffocating him. Suddenly, he tripped, stumbling forward into a thick patch of brambles. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, as though the very earth beneath him was trying to pull him down. Something cold and wet brushed against the back of his neck, and he froze, his body rigid with fear. The footsteps had stopped. A low whisper, barely audible over the rain, drifted through the trees. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Leave now." Ethan turned, his heart hammering in his chest. But he saw nothing, only the trees, their branches twisting toward him like fingers reaching out of the dark. He ran again. He didn't know for how long, only that he had to escape. The forest had become a maze, and the more he tried to navigate it, the more it shifted and reshaped itself around him. It was like the trees themselves were playing with him, trapping him in a nightmare of endless corridors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke through the woods and stumbled into an open clearing. Another one, but this one felt different. The air was still. The rain had stopped, and in the center of the clearing stood the campfire, still burning faintly, waiting for him. The abandoned campsite, the same one he had stumbled upon earlier. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. He hadn't escaped. He hadn't gone anywhere. The woods had changed again, and now they were watching. Ethan knew, with chilling certainty, that he would never leave this place. Story 3. The Muddy Child. The rain had come unexpectedly, a torrential downpour that seemed to fall from nowhere, drenching everything in its path. The forest, once alive with the gentle hum of the wind and the calls of birds, had quickly turned into a thundering wall of water. Logan, a seasoned hiker, had been on his way back from a 2-day trek through the woods, but now The path ahead had become a slick and treacherous mess. The trail was barely visible under the layers of rainwater and mud, and his dog, Max, had long since darted off into the trees, as if chasing something that only he could hear. "Max!" Logan called out, squinting through the rain. The dog had always been energetic, but today something felt off. Logan's heart pounded as he hurried down the trail, the rain pelting his face and soaking through his jacket. "Max!" he shouted again, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. The woods had never felt so oppressive. The trees, thick with foliage, seemed to close in around him, their branches creaking and swaying violently under the force of the wind. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Logan felt the creeping unease that always came when nature suddenly turned against him. But it was Max's sudden disappearance that had him on edge. Max was never one to run off, especially not during a storm. Logan's boots splashed through the mud as he pushed forward, his calls becoming more frantic with each passing minute. And then, through the fog of rain, he saw something, a flicker of movement up ahead. He quickened his pace, heart racing, and soon found himself standing at the edge of a small, muddy clearing. Max was there, sitting at the center of the clearing, his coat matted with wet dirt. Logan felt a rush of relief and moved toward him, but as he drew closer, something stopped him cold. There next to Max was a child, a small figure, hunched over in the mud, completely covered from head to toe in dark, sludgy dirt. The child was eerily still, not moving a muscle. The hair, clumped together in dirty strands, hung in a tangled mess over its face. For a moment, Logan stood frozen, unsure if he was seeing things clearly in the downpour. The child had no visible expression, no sign of life, and no reaction to Max, who was now sitting quietly beside it. "Hey," Logan called softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" The child did not respond, not even a twitch. Logan took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The child had an unnatural stillness to it, as though it wasn't fully present. It wasn't the posture of a child simply waiting for help. It was as if the child had been waiting for far longer than a normal person should. The storm had just started, so how could they have been here for any length of time? Logan knelt down cautiously, his heart beating faster. "Hey, little one, are you lost?" The child finally moved, slowly lifting its head, revealing its face. Logan's stomach dropped as he stared into the wide, blank eyes of the child. There was something deeply unsettling about those eyes. Empty, almost hollow. The face, smeared with dirt, had no expression of fear or sadness or even curiosity. It was just blank, as if it didn't understand what had happened to it. "I'm waiting for the rain to stop," the child said in a soft, flat voice. Logan's breath caught. The child's voice was distant, almost robotic, as though the words had been rehearsed. Logan glanced up at the dark sky, the storm showing no signs of letting up. "Rain," Logan repeated, glancing at the thick sheets of water pouring from the sky. "It's not going to stop anytime soon. You need to come with me. Where are your parents?" The child remained silent for a moment, looking at him with those hollow eyes. The pause stretched on for far too long, and Logan felt an eerie chill creep down his spine. The wind howled around him, pushing the rain sideways, but the child seemed unfazed by the weather, unaffected by the storm that drenched Logan to his bones. "I don't have parents," the child finally responded, its voice still flat, devoid of emotion. "I've been waiting." Logan's mind raced. "For how long?" he asked, already dreading the answer. The child blinked slowly, and when it spoke again, its voice took on a strange, almost otherworldly quality. "I've been here for a long time. I've been waiting for someone to find me." Logan's instinct screamed that something was wrong. The way the child spoke, the eerie stillness, the way it seemed so disconnected. It wasn't just the storm that made this situation feel off. It was the child itself. No normal child would be alone in these woods, covered in mud, with no sign of life except for those hollow eyes and strange words. "Listen," Logan said, his voice more insistent now. "We need to get out of here. It's not safe. You can't stay here." The child's lips parted slightly, and for the first time, it seemed to focus on Logan, its gaze intensifying. "I am not lost," it said. "I'm waiting for the rain to stop, so I can leave." Logan felt a shiver run down his spine. The words hit him like a cold wave, as if they weren't meant for him. The child's voice wasn't human anymore. It sounded like it was saying something older, darker, something that had been waiting, not just for the rain, but for the right moment to reveal itself. Max suddenly growled low in his throat, his fur bristling, and Logan glanced at the dog, alarmed. Max was usually friendly, but something had triggered his protective instincts. The dog's eyes were wide, his ears flat against his head as he stared at the child, not in curiosity, but with obvious fear. "Max," Logan said softly, his heart hammering in his chest. "What's wrong, boy?" Max whined, but refused to move closer to the child. Instead, he backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. Logan felt his stomach tighten. He had seen Max act protective before, but never like this. There was a palpable sense of danger in the air now, something that was beyond just the threat of a storm. The child, still sitting in the mud, turned its gaze toward Max. "He doesn't like me," it whispered, and the words carried a strange weight, an unnatural resonance that chilled Logan to the bone. "Max, come here," Logan urged, feeling an uneasy pressure in his chest. But Max refused to budge. The dog was staring at the child with wide, fearful eyes, growling softly under his breath. The child's lips curled into a strange, unsettling smile, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "He's afraid of me," it said, its voice now carrying a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You should be afraid too." Logan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. His heart pounded in his chest as the air around him seemed to shift. The clearing felt wrong, the trees bending at odd angles, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. "I'm not afraid of you," Logan said, trying to force his voice to sound steady, though the words felt hollow in his throat. The child didn't respond, but instead stood up, its movements slow and jerky, as if it was still adjusting to something that didn't belong. And then, with a sudden, eerie crack of thunder, the child lunged. It wasn't like a human child anymore. It was a thing, something that had been waiting for far too long in the rain, something that was not of this world. Its hands reached out, mud dripping from its fingers, its mouth still stretched in that terrifying, unnatural smile. Logan turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees shifting and moving as if the woods themselves were trying to trap him. Max was already ahead of him, barking frantically, as if urging him to run faster. Logan didn't look back. He didn't stop running until he finally stumbled out of the woods and into a clearing, the sound of the rain still pounding behind him. But when he glanced over his shoulder, there was no sign of the child, just the trees swaying gently in the storm. Logan didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his car, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. And when he looked at Max, the dog was still trembling, his eyes wide with fear. Logan wasn't sure what he had encountered in those woods, but he knew one thing for certain. The child was no ordinary lost soul. It had been waiting for something, and it had tried to claim him. Something dark had been lurking in those woods, and Logan hoped he'd never have to go back to find out what it really was. Story 4. The Rain That Calls. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life and unwind in nature. Ethan had planned this solo camping trip for weeks, seeking solitude in the dense forest far from the city's constant hum. A brief storm in the forecast didn't deter him. If anything, he looked forward to the rain's cleansing touch, the sound of droplets tapping against the leaves as he read his book by the campfire. But as night fell and the rain began to fall harder than expected, something in the air shifted. The first drops had been gentle, soothing even, but now the rain came in sheets, flooding the forest floor and drenching everything it touched. It wasn't just the rain that unsettled Ethan, though. It was the whispers, the soft voices that seemed to ride the wind, carrying his name through the storm. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. The forest around him was a blur, the trees shaking in the wind, their leaves battered by the storm. He squinted into the dark, his heart quickening. It couldn't be anyone else. He was alone in these woods. "Help!" The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. His name, Ethan. His pulse quickened. He didn't imagine it. Someone was out there calling to him. But who? And why? His first instinct was to ignore it, to curl up in his tent and ride out the storm. But the voice tugged at something deep inside of him. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. Maybe it was a hiker lost in the storm, or worse, someone who had been trapped here for days. The rain grew heavier, almost deafening now, but the voice grew louder, more desperate. Ethan, help, please. Ethan. His mind raced. What if it was someone he knew? What if they were in danger? Compelled by an urge he couldn't explain, Ethan grabbed his flashlight and plunged into the woods, his boots slipping on the wet earth. The rain poured down in torrents, the trail barely visible under the canopy of trees, but the voice seemed to guide him, faint but unmistakable, pulling him deeper into the forest. Ethan. The voice grew clearer, louder. It wasn't just calling his name anymore. It was pleading. Ethan, please help me. He moved faster, adrenaline kicking in, pushing him to follow the voice despite the dark, despite the storm. His thoughts raced as the woods around him seemed to shift, the trees twisting and bending, the shadows of the storm closing in on him. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, urging him forward. The wind howled in his ears, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he was just imagining the voice, if the storm had simply tricked his mind into hearing things. But no, there it was again, his name, louder now, desperate. Ethan, please help me. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his legs aching as he pushed on. The rain lashed at his face, blurring his vision, but he refused to stop. The sound of his name echoed around him, louder with every step he took, until he felt certain he was close. And then, through the misty haze of rain and fog, he saw something, a figure in the distance, standing still in the middle of a small clearing. It was a body, a person. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The figure was barely visible through the sheets of rain, but there was something eerily familiar about it. As he drew closer, he felt a chill run down his spine. The body was sprawled on the ground, drenched in rainwater, but its eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at him. A shiver crawled up Ethan's back as he neared the figure. The voice, it was coming from the body. Ethan, help me. The words were barely a whisper, but Ethan could hear them clearly. He stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. The figure's eyes, empty, hollow, and full of a strange, unsettling longing, stared at him without moving. There was something off about it. Ethan's stomach churned as the realization hit him. The body was not lifeless. It wasn't dead. It was breathing. Ethan, the voice came again, pleading, please, help me. The rain had become a torrential downpour, drenching Ethan through to his bones. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of the storm, but the voice from the body seemed to ignore the chaos around it, its whispers clearer and more desperate than ever. Help, please. Ethan's throat tightened, panic rising in his chest. His mind spun as he knelt beside the body, his flashlight trembling in his hand. It was a man, or at least it had been. The clothes were soaked, the skin pale, and the body was bloated with water, as though it had been lying out in the rain for far too long. But those eyes were open, locked on Ethan with an intensity that chilled him to his core. Who are you?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure's mouth moved again, forming words, but they came out garbled, as though they were struggling to break free from some invisible restraint. The voice, though faint, carried an undeniable urgency. "Help! Trapped, lost." Ethan's head spun. This couldn't be real. The man, whoever he was, should have been dead. But instead, he was here, alive in some twisted, impossible way, calling for help even though he had no right to. "Who are you?" Ethan asked again, louder this time, his hand reaching out to touch the man's shoulder. But as his fingers made contact, the man's body jerked violently, as if waking from a long, deep slumber. His mouth opened wide, the words coming out in a gurgling gasp. "No, not me, someone else trapped." Ethan recoiled, his heart pounding, as he pulled his hand away. Something was terribly wrong. The body shouldn't be alive. This shouldn't be happening. The rain fell harder still, beating down on him, blurring the world around him into a thick mist of water and shadows. The figure's eyes never left him, though, and the desperate words kept coming. "Help me. I can't breathe. Trapped under the ground." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The words made no sense. The man's body was wet and bloated, as if he had been lying in the rain for days, weeks even, and yet he was still alive, or at least alive enough to speak. The eyes were what haunted him most, their blank, hollow gaze never shifting, never blinking. Ethan staggered back, his mind racing. Something in the air was wrong. The storm had grown more violent, the trees thrashing in the wind, and the shadows around him seemed to move, to twist. The whispers of the man echoed in his ears, but now they were joined by others. Dozens of voices, all pleading, all calling his name. They all spoke at once, the chorus growing louder, frantic. Ethan's pulse raced as he turned and ran. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The voices followed him, the rain pounding harder than ever, the cries echoing behind him, growing louder, more desperate. "Ethan, help me, please, help me." The forest blurred around him as he sprinted back, his feet slipping in the mud, the voices haunting him with every step. The rain stung his skin, but the fear that gripped him was worse than the storm. When Ethan finally reached his campsite, gasping for breath, the world seemed to fall silent. The storm was still raging, but the voices were gone. The rain still hammered against the earth, but there was no longer the sickening, pleading echo of those cries. Ethan collapsed beside his tent, trembling. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The body in the clearing, the pleading voice, it didn't add up. But what had been real? What had he seen? As he looked out into the forest, the rain still fell, relentless, and for a moment, Ethan could swear he saw a shadow move between the trees. A figure standing still in the mist, its eyes wide and staring back at him. He couldn't help but feel that the rain still called for him. Story 5. The Wet Mirror. The forest was dense, its towering pines stretching upward like silent sentinels in the gloom. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath was soft, saturated with the remnants of yesterday's rain. Richard, an experienced traveler with a love for solitude, had ventured deep into this remote stretch of wilderness to escape the bustle of modern life. He knew the area was infamous for its frequent and unpredictable storms, but that was exactly why he came. There was something about the isolation, the rawness of the land, that called to him. He'd found a small, secluded spot in the woods by a bubbling stream, a perfect place to set up camp. With the rain clouds rolling in above him, he set up his tent quickly, securing the ropes as the first drops began to fall. The forest seemed to sigh under the weight of the storm as Richard settled down, starting a small fire with wet wood. The crackling of the flames, though weak at first, brought a sense of warmth that comforted him against the chill creeping through the forest. But as the rain intensified, something began to feel off. Richard shrugged it off at first, distracted by the fire. He was alone, and everything was as it should be. Still, there was an unease in the air, a strange heaviness that he couldn't quite explain. The sound of the rain became all-consuming, a continuous drumming on the canopy above him, the water spilling in torrents down to the earth below. As the storm raged on, the landscape began to change. The puddles of rainwater that had gathered on the forest floor started to catch his attention. At first, they were nothing more than shallow pools reflecting the muted light, just another feature of the wet wilderness. But soon Richard noticed something strange, his reflection. It wasn't exactly wrong. It was him, unmistakably, standing there by the fire, but the face that stared back at him in the water seemed different. The first time he noticed it, he dismissed it as a trick of the light, but then he saw it again, in the deep puddles nearby, where the water had pooled near the base of a tree. Richard saw himself clearly reflected. His face was the same, sharp jaw, dark hair, and eyes that were still adjusting to the dim light. But there was something unsettling about it. His reflection, as it stared back at him, seemed to be grinning. At first, Richard thought it was a trick of the mind. Maybe it was the shadows, or maybe the rain was playing tricks on his eyes. But the longer he stared, the more apparent it became. The reflection in the puddle was smiling. Not a small, subtle smile, but a wide, twisted grin, stretching unnaturally across the reflection's face. Richard's heart began to race. He turned away, pacing in the small space around his camp, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping up his spine. It was just the rain, just the storm. He tried to convince himself, tried to focus on the fire crackling beside him. But when he glanced back down at the puddles, his own face was still grinning at him. This time, it was more pronounced, the reflection's eyes gleaming in the shallow water with a malevolent gleam. It wasn't a grin of amusement. It was a grin of mockery. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him, the air thick and oppressive, as if the rain itself had become a living thing, watching him. The reflection's grin widened, as if it were amused by his growing sense of dread. It wasn't just a trick of the light anymore. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Trying to shake off the growing panic, Richard knelt down beside the puddle, his eyes locked with his reflection. He reached out, his fingers brushing the wet surface of the water, the droplets sending ripples across the face in the reflection. The grin stayed. The eyes never blinked. He pulled his hand back, his mind racing with every possible explanation. Perhaps it was some kind of hallucination, he thought. Maybe the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on him. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, he couldn't deny the deep, sinking feeling that something far worse was happening. Then, the reflection's grin began to change. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift. But then the edges of the smile began to stretch further, almost impossibly so. Richard stepped back, his legs trembling as the twisted face in the water began to contort in ways that were wrong. The grin widened grotesquely, and for a moment, the reflection seemed to lift its head, its eyes moving independently of Richard's own gaze. His heart hammered in his chest. Was it mimicking him, or was it alive? The reflection had become something more, something that was no longer simply a mirror of his actions. The figure in the water was watching him, anticipating his next move. Richard stood up abruptly, his mind racing. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the puddle. It was like a magnet, pulling him back, compelling him to look. His reflection's smile grew even wider, now revealing sharp teeth, jagged and unnaturally long. The eyes behind the grin glinted with something dark, something unholy. Not so pleasant, is it? The reflection whispered, the voice a hollow, mocking echo. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The voice came from the puddle, his voice, but it was distorted, colder, and empty. No, Richard whispered, stepping back, his heart pounding wildly. This isn't real. But as he turned to flee, the rain intensified. The storm seemed to follow him, closing in from all sides, the wind howling like an angry beast. The trees around him groaned under the pressure of the storm, their branches swaying violently as if alive, reaching out toward him. The puddles, once calm, had grown, expanding like dark pools of ink, covering the ground in every direction. Richard turned back toward his tent, but the path seemed longer than it should have been. His mind raced, confusion and fear battling for control. When he glanced down at the nearest puddle, his reflection was no longer standing still. It was moving. The reflection in the puddle now stood, mirroring his exact movements, but its grin was wide, impossibly so. Its eyes gleamed with malice. It stepped out of the puddle, its feet making no sound on the wet earth. Richard stumbled back, his mind trying to process the impossible. How could it be? The reflection was stepping into the world of the living. "Help me, Richard," it whispered in his own voice. "Come join me." The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward him. Richard recoiled, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to get away. He couldn't stay here. He didn't know what this thing was, but it was not him. It was something twisted, something hungry. The rain, unrelenting, lashed against his face as he bolted toward the shelter of his tent, his heart in his throat. Behind him, the sound of footsteps followed, wet, slapping against the earth, getting closer with every passing second. But when he reached his tent and turned around, there was nothing. The puddles had vanished. The reflection was gone. The rain, though still falling heavily, no longer felt like a threat. It was simply water, running freely across the ground, collecting into the streams and rivulets that crisscrossed the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, the tension momentarily broken. But Richard knew that he was not alone. As he sat in the silence of his tent, the darkness pressing in on him, the storm raged on outside, and in the stillness, a voice echoed in his mind, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Not alone, and somewhere in the dark, Richard knew that it was only a matter of time before the rain would call again. Story 6. The Rain-Eaten Map. It had been hours since the storm had rolled in, and the rain showed no signs of relenting. The trail, once a clearly marked path through the forest, was now a treacherous maze of mud and swirling water. The group of hikers, 3 friends from college, had expected a weekend of adventure, but the storm had made their journey a lot less enjoyable. They had hoped to reach the mountain summit by nightfall, but the storm had forced them to change their plans. Their names were Ethan, Olivia, and Ben, and after wandering through the soaked woods, they had stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin nestled at the foot of a towering oak. It was an unexpected sight in the wilderness, one that seemed out of place, an abandoned relic of a bygone time. But with the rain turning the forest into a flood zone, the cabin provided shelter, and they decided to wait out the storm inside. The door creaked on rusty hinges as they entered, the musty scent of damp would filling their lungs. The cabin was small, with a stone fireplace that had long since been abandoned and windows barely intact. But as they made their way further into the cabin, Olivia's eyes caught something unusual in the corner. A small, rotting chest, half hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers and broken furniture. Curiosity piqued. She carefully pried open the chest. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a weathered old map. Ethan and Ben crowded around her, their curiosity mounting. The map was old, that much was clear, but it seemed well preserved considering its age. The paper felt brittle under their fingers, as if it might disintegrate with the slightest touch. What was more intriguing was the strange symbols that adorned the map. Unfamiliar lines and markings that seemed to tell a story of hidden treasure. "Looks like we've found something interesting," Ethan said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Could be an old treasure map." Ben leaned over Olivia's shoulder, examining the map closely. "There's a mark here," he said, pointing to a spot deep within the woods. "It looks like it leads to something, The three of them huddled together, studying the faded ink. The map appeared to lead to a location on the mountain that was clearly marked with an X. The name of the location was scrawled next to the symbol, the Hollow's End. There was no mention of what the treasure was, only cryptic instructions. Follow the rain's path. For a moment, the promise of hidden riches stirred something in all of them, an irresistible call to adventure. The storm raged outside, and though the weather was frightful, the idea of discovering treasure was too tantalizing to ignore. "We've got nothing else to do," Olivia said with a smile, her excitement contagious. "Let's go find this treasure." The group made preparations to leave, though the rain had only intensified. They bundled up and grabbed their packs, making sure they had enough gear to last. The map, now safely folded in Ethan's jacket, was their guide. The rain was relentless, but the friends pushed forward, following the trail as indicated by the map. The landscape around them was barely recognizable in the downpour. Trees looked like dark shadows against the gray sky, and the ground had turned into a treacherous quagmire. But they kept moving, their feet sinking into the mud with every step. It didn't take long for the map to start showing signs of wear. As the rain soaked through the paper, the ink began to blur, and strange, faint symbols began to appear on the map, ones that hadn't been there before. At first, it was subtle, a small line appearing beside a path they had already walked, a number scrawled in a corner where there had once been none. Olivia squinted at it, puzzled. "Did you guys see that?" she asked, holding the map up to the dim light. "What do you mean?" Ben asked, wiping rain from his face. "Look here," Olivia said, pointing to the symbols. "They weren't there before. They're changing." Ethan peered over her shoulder. "That's weird, but we're in the middle of a storm. It's probably just the water messing with the map." But as the rain continued to fall, the changes became more drastic. The ink began to bleed into the wet paper, dissolving in places. The paths they had been following seemed to erase themselves, replaced by new ones that twisted and turned in confusing directions. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Ben said, his voice uneasy. "We should turn back." But Ethan, ever the adventurer, was determined. "No, we're close. Look, we're almost there. We can't stop now." Reluctantly, the group continued on, the rain soaking them through to the bone. The map was becoming harder to read with each passing minute, the details disappearing as more and more of it dissolved into the wetness. Finally, they reached the spot marked the Hollow's End, or so they thought. The area was a small clearing in the woods, surrounded by twisted trees and thick underbrush. There was nothing remarkable about the place. No hidden chest, no clue that this was the location they'd been searching for. Just the constant, oppressive sound of the rain falling around them. "This is it?" Olivia asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "I don't see anything here." Ethan was holding the map in his hands, his face pale as he stared at it. The symbols had started to shift once again, swirling and changing in ways that made no sense. The X marking the treasure location was now a jagged, distorted shape, almost as if the map itself were trying to escape from his grasp. "I don't understand," Ethan muttered, staring at the map with growing dread. "It's like it's alive." Ben took a step forward, his voice quiet. "I think the map is telling us something. Something we don't understand." The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and for the first time, they felt a deep unease settle over them. The rain began to fall harder, the droplets hammering the ground like nails. It was as if the forest was closing in on them, the very trees seeming to bend toward them, pressing them into the clearing. Then, out of the corner of Ethan's eye, he saw something. A shape moving in the distance. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing in the pouring rain. He spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. "Did you see that?" The others turned to look, but the figure was gone. Just the rain, falling in sheets, as if nothing had happened. They stared at each other, the air thick with tension. "Okay, this is getting way too weird," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here," Ben added, his eyes scanning the dark trees. "This isn't right." But before they could make a move, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the forest, like something ancient, something far beyond their understanding, was awakening. The rain seemed to intensify, now pelting them from every direction, as if the storm itself was alive, angry, and determined to drive them further into the woods. Suddenly, the symbols on the map became clear, as if they were glowing with an eerie light. They were no longer instructions. They were a warning. "Run," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. "The treasure. It's not what we think." But it was too late. As they turned to flee, the earth split open before them, revealing a dark, yawning abyss. The rain pooled around the edges, swirling in a vortex of water and mud. And from the depths, something ancient and terrible reached out, dragging them into the darkness, the map disintegrating into the rain, its secrets lost forever. The storm eventually passed. The forest was quiet once again, save for the occasional drip of water falling from the trees. But the clearing was empty. The treasure, the map, the hikers gone. Only the storm knew what had really happened, and it was keeping its secrets hidden beneath the endless, unforgiving rain. Story 7. The Echoing Cabin. The storm had been relentless for hours. Rain lashed against the windows of the camper's van, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them as if the forest itself were alive. The mountain pass they were trying to navigate had become a nightmare. Mudslides blocked the path, and the dark clouds overhead seemed to trap them in an endless night. Tired and frustrated, 5 friends, Adam, Sarah, Lucas, Rachel, and Emma, had been on a weekend camping trip to escape the stress of city life. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat had turned into a desperate struggle for safety. The map they had been following was now useless. The storm had turned familiar landmarks into an indistinguishable blur of fog and rain. "We can't keep going like this," Adam said, his voice low and strained. "We need shelter. We won't make it through the night otherwise." Lucas, ever the optimist, looked around. "Look, I think I saw something up ahead. A cabin, maybe? It's hard to tell through the rain, but it's better than camping out in the mud." The group, relieved by the prospect of refuge, trudged through the downpour toward the faint outline of the building Lucas had spotted. As they got closer, the cabin materialized from the mist, an old, weather-beaten structure with dark wooden walls and a sagging roof. It didn't look like it belonged on any map, but in that moment, it was a welcome sight. With a collective sigh of relief, they approached the cabin's door, which creaked open with little resistance. The interior was dimly lit by the glow of the fireplace, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. It smelled of damp wood and earth, a stark contrast to the fresh, pine-scented air outside. They all stepped in, grateful for the dry shelter, but the feeling of unease crept over them. The place had an old, abandoned vibe. Dust clung to every surface, and the furniture looked as though it had been left undisturbed for decades. "We're safe for now," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Let's settle in and wait for the storm to pass." The group piled their bags in one corner, and Emma started a fire in the hearth. The warmth from the flames was soothing, and for a brief moment, they allowed themselves to relax. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was comforting, almost hypnotic. But as they settled in, a strange thing happened. At first, it was subtle. The voices of the group, as they talked and laughed, seemed to echo slightly within the cabin, as if there was another version of them, lingering just out of sight. Adam didn't think much of it. The acoustics of old buildings sometimes created strange effects. But when the voices began to repeat, word for word, exactly what they said, he paused. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Everyone stopped what they were doing and listened. From the far side of the room, the exact words Adam had just spoken seemed to drift back to him, like a whisper bouncing off the walls. "Did you hear that?" Rachel frowned, looking around. "I think we're hearing things. It's probably just the storm messing with our heads." But it wasn't the storm. The voices kept coming, faint at first, but steadily growing louder and more distinct. It was as though the cabin itself was repeating everything they said, a faint echo of their own voices trapped in the walls. "This is weird," Lucas said. "It's like the cabin is alive or something." The others laughed nervously, trying to brush off the discomfort they were starting to feel. But the repeated words were unnerving. It didn't help that, as the hours passed, the voices began to distort. It wasn't just repetition anymore. The echoes began to mimic their tones and inflections, as if someone, something, was listening and responding. As the night wore on, things grew darker, both outside and inside the cabin. The storm raged even harder, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop inexplicably. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Emma was the first to notice something was truly wrong. As she sat near the fire, she heard a soft whisper from behind her. "Emma!" She turned, her heart leaping in her chest. There was no one there. The room was empty, save for her friends, who were scattered around the cabin. "Did anyone say my name?" she asked, her voice shaking. The others exchanged glances, but no one had spoken. Then, from behind her, in the same soft whisper, came the voice again. "Emma!" She spun around, but once more the room was still. The cabin seemed unnaturally silent, the wind outside muffled by the thick walls. "I swear I just heard it again," Emma said, her breath coming in short gasps. "Maybe it's just the wind," Rachel suggested, though her voice didn't sound as certain. She stood up and walked toward Emma. "It's probably just the house settling." But as Rachel moved across the room, the whispers continued, now repeating every word they said, but with a darker edge to them. "Maybe it's just the house settling." The voice echoed in a mocking tone. The group froze. They hadn't spoken those words yet, but the cabin had. "It's repeating us," Lucas said quietly, his voice tense. "That's not all," Sarah added, her face pale. "Listen." The whispers, now growing louder, were no longer mimicking their speech. Instead, they began to reveal things, dark, hidden secrets that none of them had ever shared. First, it was subtle. "I'm not who I say I am," the voice echoed from behind them. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the words reverberated through the cabin. "Sarah," the voice hissed, "you've been hiding something." The fire crackled, casting flickering light across the room, but the warmth was gone. A chill had settled in, and the echoing voices seemed to vibrate through their bones. What is this?" Rachel gasped, stepping back. The voices didn't stop. "Rachel, you don't remember that night, do you? The night you never told anyone about." Rachel's face drained of color. The voice had come from all around her, repeating the secrets she had buried long ago. It wasn't just the words they had spoken. It was their thoughts, their hidden regrets, their fears, now being dragged to the surface. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Sarah murmured, almost unconsciously, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Suddenly, the room went cold. The fireplace crackled wildly, sending sparks into the air. Emma gasped as the walls seemed to close in on them, the whispers becoming a cacophony of tortured voices, angry, desperate, pleading. They were no longer their own voices. The echoes had taken on a life of their own. "Adam," the voice whispered, "you never told anyone what happened that night in the woods." Adam's breath caught in his throat. He had long buried the memories, too ashamed to speak of what he had done. The whisper became louder, more insistent. "You can't hide from the truth," it hissed. The group huddled together, fear gripping their hearts. The echoes were no longer just about them. They were about something older, something that had existed in this cabin long before they had arrived. The whispers were alive, feeding off their own secrets, twisting them, mocking them. "I can't take this anymore," Emma cried, her voice breaking. "We need to leave. Now." But when they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The storm outside raged harder than ever, but the cabin's interior had taken on an unnatural stillness. They were trapped, not by the storm, but by something far more terrifying. The voices grew louder, almost deafening. They had stopped repeating their words. Now, they were speaking of their deepest fears. "Leave before it's too late," the voice whispered, now taking on a guttural, sinister tone. Desperate, they turned toward the window. The storm had stopped. The rain had ceased. But outside, there was nothing but darkness, an endless void that stretched out beyond the cabin, and something watching them. The echoes reached a fever pitch as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. With a final, thunderous crash, the cabin door burst open, and they ran into the night. They never spoke of that night again, but each of them knew deep down that they hadn't escaped the cabin. The echoes of the past, the dark secrets they had tried to bury, would haunt them forever. The storm may have ended, but the voices in the cabin never stopped calling. Story 8. The Waterlogged Phantom. The storm had been relentless for hours, a torrential downpour that seemed to wash away everything in its path. The sky, an unbroken stretch of dark clouds, cast the forest in a permanent twilight. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind howled through the trees, bending the branches like skeletal arms reaching for the heavens. A group of 4 campers, Emma, Ryan, Lucy, and Daniel, had set out on a weekend hiking trip to the nearby national forest, hoping for an escape from the noise and stress of their daily lives. They hadn't expected the storm, of course. They were experienced campers, used to the unpredictability of the wilderness, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer ferocity of the rain. "We need to find shelter," Ryan said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. He had been leading them through the dense woods, trying to find a clearing or a cabin where they could wait out the storm. "It's getting worse by the minute." Emma, who had been trailing behind, pulled her rain jacket tighter around her and glanced at the others. They were all soaked through, and the path had become slippery and treacherous. Every step felt like a gamble, as if the earth itself might swallow them whole. "Should we turn back?" Lucy asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know how much farther we can go in this." Daniel, always the adventurous one, was scanning the forest around them, his face obscured by a rain-soaked hood. "We can't go back now. We've come too far. Let's push on. We'll find something soon." But as they trudged deeper into the woods, something shifted in the atmosphere. The rain began to fall harder, the sound deafening as it hit the leaves and earth around them. Yet, through the relentless downpour, something strange happened. The sound of the rain seemed to soften, almost as if the storm itself had been muffled. Ryan stopped abruptly, holding up his hand. "Do you hear that?" The others froze, their gazes shifting to Ryan. At first, They thought it was just the wind or the storm playing tricks on their ears. But then they heard it, faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. The sound of someone walking through the thick mud and rain, each step heavy and deliberate. "Who's there?" Emma called out, her voice rising in a mix of curiosity and caution. "Hello." There was no response, only the eerie sound of wet footsteps, slow and methodical, moving toward them through the downpour. The sound was coming from ahead of them, just out of sight, hidden behind a veil of rain. Suddenly, through the thick mist and sheets of water, a figure appeared. It was a man, drenched to the bone, his clothes sticking to his skin, his face obscured by the water that streamed down from his soaked hair. The figure stood still, just beyond the edge of their vision, as if waiting for them to notice him. The campers' hearts raced as they exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't seen anyone else on their hike, and this man seemed out of place, too still, too quiet despite the storm. "Who are you?" Ryan called, his voice firmer now. "Are you lost?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he began to move slowly toward them, his steps unnaturally slow, as if he was walking through thick water. But the storm wasn't stopping him. The rain seemed to wash off him without any effect. He was drenched, yet he did not appear to be bothered by the downpour. As the figure drew closer, Emma noticed something odd. His movements were fluid, but there was something unnatural about them. Too perfect, too deliberate. It was as if he wasn't really walking at all, but rather gliding just above the ground. "Should we go after him?" Daniel asked, his voice a mix of caution and curiosity. "Maybe he's in trouble." Before anyone could respond, the figure did something unexpected. He stopped, turned his head slowly toward them, and then, as if he had never been there at all, he vanished into the trees, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness of the forest. For a moment, the campers stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the bizarre encounter. But then they heard it, the sound of footsteps again, only this time the footsteps were not coming from where the figure had disappeared. They were coming from behind them, closer now, moving faster, as if whatever it was had circled around and was now coming for them. "Run," Ryan said, his voice a whisper of panic. "We need to get out of here." Without a second thought, the group turned and began to sprint through the rain, their feet slipping in the mud as they tried to outrun whatever was following them. But no matter how fast they ran, the sound of those footsteps never stopped. They echoed in the downpour, always just behind them, gaining ground with every step they took. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees now closing in around them, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. It felt as though the very woods were alive, shifting and warping with every stride they took. And in the distance, the figure appeared again, flickering in and out of sight, leading them deeper into the forest with each glimpse. "Why is it following us?" Lucy gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs as they ran. "I don't know," Emma cried, "but it's like it's trying to lead us somewhere." like it's guiding us into the woods. And then it hit them. The footsteps weren't just following them. They were guiding them, pushing them in a certain direction. Every time they veered off the path, the footsteps would stop and the figure would reappear, as if to nudge them back onto the trail. "We need to get off this path," Daniel said, his voice trembling with fear. "Let's go the other way, away from it." But no matter what direction they tried to run, the sound of the footsteps always circled around them, pushing them back toward the trees, toward the figure. Eventually, after what felt like hours of running through the storm, the group reached a small clearing. They stopped, panting and terrified, looking around at the trees that seemed to close in on them from every angle. The rain was still pouring down, drenching them to the bone, but now the forest was deathly silent. No more footsteps, no more figure. They stood there, exhausted, trying to gather their bearings. The storm had begun to subside, the heavy rain turning into a soft drizzle, but the feeling of unease lingered in the air. "It's gone," Ryan whispered, his voice still shaky. "I think we lost it." But as they started to relax, something odd happened. The ground beneath their feet trembled, faintly at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. The trees around them began to sway, their branches creaking as if they were bending under a heavy weight. And then, from the shadows of the trees, a voice, low and soft, like the rustle of leaves, whispered through the clearing. "Come." It was the figure's voice, the same voice that had never spoken before, now beckoning them toward the depths of the forest. Before they could react, the air grew heavy, and a chill crawled down their spines. The sound of footsteps began again, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. But this time, it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground, from the very air around them. In that moment, they realized the truth. The figure had never been real. It was a phantom, a lure, drawing them deeper into the heart of the forest. And now, the forest itself was alive with the sound of footsteps, countless footsteps, circling, closing in. With one last glance at each other, the group turned and fled into the darkness of the woods, the footsteps following them, relentless and inexorable. They would never know who or what had been luring them or why. All they knew was that the forest had claimed them, and the waterlogged phantom would never let them escape. Story 9. The Rain's Curse. The wind howled through the trees, pushing the thick rain in sheets that stung the skin like tiny needles. The dark clouds above seemed to churn with a life of their own, threatening to swallow the sun completely. The forest around the campsite was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant thunder, a foreboding atmosphere that seemed to press in from every direction. A group of 5 friends, Caleb, Sarah, Mia, Lucas, and Ben, had come to the outskirts of the national forest for a weekend camping trip. They'd been planning this trip for months, eager to get away from the chaos of their busy lives in the city. They had no idea that the land they had chosen for their camp was once the site of an ancient burial ground, long abandoned and forgotten by the outside world. The rain began as a light drizzle in the early afternoon, but by the time evening fell, it had transformed into an unforgiving downpour. As they set up their tent and gathered around the campfire, the friends laughed and joked, oblivious to the dark history of the land beneath their feet. "I think we're going to need more firewood," Ben said, standing up and brushing the rain from his jacket. "This storm's not letting up anytime soon." "Be careful," Sarah warned, her eyes scanning the thick forest around them. "You don't want to wander too far in this weather." Ben shrugged off her warning and headed toward the nearby woods, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. He didn't believe in superstitions, but there was something about the atmosphere here that set him on edge. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, and the ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost as if it were shifting. As Ben walked deeper into the forest, he heard the distinct sound of cracking branches behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only the sound of the rain and wind. Unnerved, he hurried back toward the camp, clutching a bundle of firewood. When he returned to the fire, his hands were trembling. "What's wrong?" Lucas asked, noticing Ben's unease. "Nothing," Ben said quickly, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "It's just, I don't know. It's like the forest doesn't want us here." Mia, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "It's just the storm playing tricks on you. You're imagining things." But Ben couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. Something about the forest, about the land they were camping on. He glanced over at the others, but they were all too busy with their own distractions to notice the uneasy look on his face. The night grew darker, and the rain continued to fall, relentless in its fury. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living creature, its mournful wail echoing through the forest. As the fire crackled and popped, the group huddled together, sharing stories and trying to ignore the ominous feeling that hung in the air. It wasn't until later that night, when the rain had reached its peak, that the strange occurrences began. At first, it was subtle, a faint itch on Caleb's arm that he couldn't explain. But when he scratched it, he noticed something odd. The skin around the spot had reddened, as though it had been burned. He looked at his friends, confused. "Is it just me, or does this look like a burn?" Caleb asked, showing him his arm. The others crowded around, looking at the marks. They didn't look like regular burns, though. They were almost purposeful, as if they had been carved into his skin. "You should get some cream for that," Sarah said, trying to brush it off. But as she spoke, she felt a strange sensation on her own wrist. When she looked down, she saw that her skin had begun to burn as well. Another mark, identical to Caleb's. "Guys," she said, her voice trembling, "this isn't normal." The rain continued to pour, and as they all inspected their bodies, they realized that more and more marks were appearing on their arms, legs, and necks. The burns were growing, their edges raw and red, spreading like vines across their skin. They burned with an intensity that wasn't just physical, but almost spiritual, as though the land itself was reaching out and claiming them. What the hell is happening? Mia shouted, panic rising in her voice. The fire seemed to flicker in response, as if reacting to the fear in the air. A gust of wind swept through the campsite, blowing out their torches and plunging them into darkness. The only light was the pale, ghostly glow of the rain-soaked landscape and the ever-growing marks on their bodies. "Something's wrong with this place," Lucas said, his voice filled with dread. He tried to move, but stumbled as if his body wasn't responding properly. He fell to the ground, his face contorted in pain. When he lifted his hand to his chest, another burn appeared there, this time much deeper, as though the skin was being scorched from the inside out. Before anyone could help him, the air around them grew colder, and the rain intensified. It was as if the storm itself was watching them, waiting. Then the whispers began. At first, it was soft, like the wind rustling through the trees, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. Voices, low and guttural, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The words seemed to echo from the very ground beneath them, like the earth itself was trying to communicate. Caleb grabbed his head in pain, his face contorting with anguish. It's inside my mind," he gasped, falling to his knees. "The voices, they won't stop." Mia and Sarah screamed as the marks on their skin burned brighter, the pain nearly unbearable. It's as if the land is alive," Sarah whispered through gritted teeth. "It's angry. It's punishing us." As they watched helplessly, the marks on their skin began to take shape, as if something was clawing its way out from beneath. Figures seemed to form in the raw, burning flesh, twisted, gnarled shapes that resembled ancient spirits, their faces contorted in agony. The storm outside had become a torrential flood. The rain didn't just fall anymore. It poured from the sky in thick sheets, soaking them to the bone. But now it wasn't the rain that terrified them. It was the figures they saw around the campsite. Apparitions, translucent but unmistakably real, began to emerge from the forest. They were covered in mud and grime, their eyes empty pits of darkness, their faces twisted with rage. The spirits walked toward them, silent and unblinking, their cold eyes never leaving the group. "Run!" Ben shouted, his voice hoarse from fear. "We need to get out of here, now!" They turned to flee, but as they moved, the forest seemed to shift and grow around them, the trees closing in on their path. No matter which direction they ran, the land itself seemed to push them back toward the center of the cursed site. The voices grew louder, filling their minds with thoughts of death, of wrath, of vengeance. As they stumbled and fell, the spirits reached out for them, their cold hands brushing against their skin, and with each touch, the burns on their bodies deepened, the pain becoming unbearable. The spirits' whispers filled the air, their voices a chorus of fury. "You desecrated the land. You awoke the curse." With a final scream, the group collapsed to the ground, their bodies burning with the fury of the storm and the rage of the spirits. The rain continued to fall, washing over them in endless waves. The marks on their bodies burned brighter with each passing moment, and as the spirits closed in, the last thing they saw was the earth beneath them opening up, pulling them into the ground. The rain never stopped, and the curse of the land remained. Story 10. The Twisted Tree. The storm had come out of nowhere, dark clouds swirling overhead like a gathering army, the wind picking up with an ominous growl. Connor, a solo camper with a passion for hiking, had been in the woods for days, savoring the peace and solitude of nature. The forecast had promised mild weather, but as the first raindrops began to fall, he knew this was no ordinary storm. The downpour started slowly, but intensified quickly, the rain coming down in sheets, drenching everything in its path. Connor looked around, scanning the woods for shelter. There was nothing for miles in every direction but trees and rocks, the forest thick and endless. His gear wasn't waterproof enough to endure the storm, and he could feel the chill of the wind starting to seep through his jacket. Desperation set in. Then, through the rain and mist, he spotted it. An ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching up like twisted fingers clawing at the sky. It was large enough to provide some cover from the rain, and its dark silhouette seemed like a safe haven in the midst of the storm. Connor quickened his pace, hoping the shelter beneath the tree would be enough to get him through the worst of it. As he approached, he noticed how massive the tree was, its trunk so wide that it would take both arms to encircle it. The roots snaked out from the base like twisted serpents, their dark forms partially exposed by the muddy ground. Despite the storm, the tree appeared to have an eerie stillness about it. Its leaves rustled in the wind, but the ground around it felt unnaturally quiet. With a sigh of relief, Connor dropped his pack beneath the shelter of the tree's massive branches, grateful to be out of the rain. He fumbled with the tarp he carried and stretched it over his campsite, creating a crude but effective barrier from the pouring rain. The air smelled earthy and damp, the thick scent of wet soil clinging to everything. Connor sat down on the ground, pulling his knees up to his chest as he watched the rain fall in sheets. The wind howled around him, but under the shelter of the tree, he was safe, at least for now. But as the storm raged, a strange feeling began to settle over him. It was subtle at first, like a tingling in the back of his neck. He dismissed it, thinking it was just the tension of being out in a storm alone. However, as time passed, the sensation grew stronger. The tree's shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, moving in ways that felt wrong. Connor turned his attention to the roots, which had been partially exposed by the heavy rain. He watched as they seemed to twitch and shift ever so slightly, as though they were alive. He blinked and looked again, but there was no mistaking it. The roots were moving, twisting and curling into the muddy earth like giant fingers grasping for something. His heart skipped a beat. The storm raged on around him, but the movement of the tree's roots had his full attention now. Connor stood up, his eyes fixed on the roots as they began to shift more rapidly, some pulling back into the ground, others pushing out of the earth like serpents coiling toward him. His breath hitched in his throat, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin despite the chill of the rain. The tree was alive. Panic clawed at him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The roots moved with purpose, drawing closer to him with every passing second. He stumbled back, his boots slipping on the wet ground, and in his panic, he tripped and fell backward. He looked up, trying to scramble to his feet, but the tree's branches seemed to have lowered, their twisted, gnarled fingers reaching down toward him. The movement of the tree grew more frantic. The roots slithered across the ground, creeping toward him with a hunger that was impossible to ignore. The bark of the tree groaned as though it were stretching and shifting, and the air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural force. The branches above him twisted like arms, reaching for him with an intent that made his blood run cold. Connor's mind raced, his thoughts a blur. He scrambled to his feet and began running, his heart pounding in his chest. But every time he tried to break away, the storm seemed to intensify, the rain blurring his vision and making it harder to find his footing. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was shifting with him, the earth seeming to pull him back toward the tree, its roots growing longer and faster with each passing moment. He looked over his shoulder, and that's when he saw it. A massive, thick root had surged from the earth and wrapped around the base of his leg. The grip was unyielding, pulling him back toward the tree as if it were trying to drag him into the very soil. Panic overtook him, and he kicked and struggled, but the root only tightened, drawing him closer to the trunk. "Help!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. No one was around. There was only the tree, its branches bending low, the roots growing ever closer, and the sound of its leaves rustling in the wind. Connor reached for his knife, but the rain had soaked it through, and it was stuck in the wet sheath. The roots dragged him further into the mud, pulling him toward the tree's trunk, where the bark had begun to twist into grotesque shapes, like faces contorted in agony. The branches above swayed, their sharp, spindly fingers beckoning him. The more Connor struggled, the stronger the pull became. The tree was alive, and it was pulling him into its grasp. Its roots were no longer just moving. They were alive, sentient and hungry. They stretched out, creeping toward him, their long, writhing forms lashing at his legs, arms, and chest. The tree was a living, breathing thing, and it wanted him. It wanted to consume him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he realized with horror that he wasn't just being pulled into the earth. The tree was trying to trap him, to keep him there forever, tangled in its twisted roots, his body drawn into the very trunk of the oak itself. Desperation surged through him, and he fought harder, pulling against the roots with every ounce of strength he had left. His hands were bleeding from the sharpness of the bark as he tried to push away from the tree's clutches. But it was too late. The rain continued to pour down, the storm growing more violent by the second. His body was being pulled deeper into the tree, his limbs heavy and unresponsive, as if the very earth were swallowing him whole. He could feel the bark against his skin, feel it shifting and growing. wrapping around him like a cocoon, imprisoning him in its grasp. The roots twisted tighter, suffocating him as the rain hammered down on his face. And as his vision blurred, he saw the tree's face emerge from the bark, a grotesque, twisted thing with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It smiled at him, its wide, horrifying grin stretching from ear to ear. Connor screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm, drowned out by the rain and the tree's relentless pull. And in that moment, as the ancient oak's roots swallowed him whole, he realized the storm wasn't just nature's fury. It was the tree's rage, and it had been waiting for someone like him, the lone camper seeking shelter, to fall into its grasp, to be claimed by its twisted, eternal hunger. The rain continued to fall, and the tree stood still, its gnarled branches swaying gently in the wind. As the storm raged on, the forest around it grew still, as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting for the next camper to wander too close. For the tree was alive, and it was always hungry.